CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The COVID-19 pandemic continues to wreak unprecedented devastation across the world on populations and also on healthcare systems and economies. As governments continue to ramp up efforts to stem the pandemic, one area of concern has been in providing adequate food for people around the world. The enforced limitations on movement have impacted our ability to grow and transport food, already leading to shortages in some areas. This is of no greater concern than in Africa. The United Nations estimates that over 40% of people live below the poverty line, with food insecurity and hunger on the rise across the continent. This week, we look at the impact of COVID-19 on food security in Africa and explore some possible solutions to ensuring adequate food is available during and after the pandemic. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Goal number 2 of the 2015 UN Sustainable Development Goals is achieving zero hunger by 2030. But there are numerous global challenges to achieving this goal. Now, more than 820 million people in the world are still hungry today, with over 250 million of these in Africa. The continent has had its fair share of challenges in the last few years, all of which have contributed to increased food insecurity. According to the United Nations, last year there were over 20,000 incidents of armed conflict, which led to the displacement of people and deterred farming and food production. 2019 will also be remembered as the year the climate crisis devastated parts of East and Southern Africa, with floods, landslides, droughts and cyclones, leaving at least 33 million people at emergency levels of food insecurity. The Horn of Africa is still reeling from a devastating locust invasion, which continues to put millions at risk. The COVID-19 pandemic has compounded these challenges, further hampering the production and movement of food. With almost all African countries affected by the virus and full or partial lockdowns in place in many countries, the challenge of food insecurity is a continent-wide crisis that requires immediate attention. On this special edition of Talk Africa, we speak to our expert guests individually via Skype as CGTN continues to observe physical distancing protocols. Let's now unpack the impact of COVID-19 on food security in Africa. Joining us first from Nairobi is Matthew McIlvenna. He's the head of Emergency Preparedness and Response at the East African Regional World Food Program Bureau. Matthew, welcome to Talk Africa today, and thank you for joining us on the program. I want to start off by getting a sense of what Africa's food situation has been prior to the corona pandemic, because Africa's food security is normally quite precarious. Parts of Africa was already suffering from the outset of the desert locust, coupled with climate change. Paint for us the current food situation and the numbers affected.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're right. I mean, there's multiple what we call shocks at play here, which have been stretching people's ability to cope for quite some time before this COVID crisis hit. One of the main drivers of hunger on the continent, particularly in this region of Eastern Horn of Africa, is conflict. Conflict leads to displacement, whether that's within borders, we call them IDPs, internally displaced people, or across borders as refugees. These people, when they become dislocated from their own means of supporting themselves, their own livelihoods, they need support. So really the core of our business is assisting these people. There's over 6 million IDPs in the Eastern Horn of Africa alone, and over 3 million refugees. There's also many other millions of people who are normally seasonally what we call food insecure, They can be affected by floods or droughts or various other sort of shocks, and like the locusts that we've seen recently as well. So the situation coming into this was precarious at best, and now these populations are now at greater risk.
So there is quite a risk already when it comes to Africa's food security. What is the impact, though, that COVID-19 has had on Africa's food security implications?
We're seeing already, for example, schools have closed. We provide school meals for over 4 million children in this region. Schools have closed. Those children are now not getting the lunch that we were providing, which is a critical source of nutrition for them. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs. So the people that normally buy food from the markets, particularly people on low incomes in the informal sector, if they don't have money, they rapidly run out of food. So we're sort of seeing ground zero, the effect of COVID in the region. The ground zero is very much these urban areas where people are losing their jobs very quickly.
So the ground zero are mainly in the urban areas, but let's stick a little bit more to maintaining the food systems in Africa, because if ground zero is in the urban areas, and yet we know that much of Africa is still very agriculturally in the rural areas. And we are also told that because Africa has a younger workforce, that probably Africa's food security may not be as adversely affected. How do you think Africa's food chain will be much impacted as a result?
I don't think Africa's immune to the effects here. We're seeing a unique dynamic in this crisis that is not only affecting the demand for food, i.e. people's incomes are going down, their livelihoods are undermined, so their ability to buy food is weakened. We're also seeing disruptions and risks in the entire food and agricultural supply chain. So all the inputs that go into food production, some of them come internationally, that those supply chains are being disrupted. So there's major risks here. We're already seeing food prices starting to increase in some parts of the region. So even those who can still afford to buy from the market, that will be their food security will be compromised by the increased prices.
So let us look at what is happening from your end, though, in terms of your organization, because you're in charge of emergency preparedness and response for the Eastern African region. What is your organization grappling with at the moment? What is your biggest challenge?
Well, our number one challenge is to try and sustain what we were doing before this crisis, feeding the people whose lives depend on the emergency food assistance that we provide. So that's the 6 million internally displaced people in the region, and the over 3 million refugees, as well as those who live in what we call marginal areas, who become food insecure during certain parts of the season, and those affected by disasters like floods. And at the moment, also those who are being affected by the locust outbreak. So our priority is to try and maintain assistance to these people. We need to be sort of pre-positioning food as much as possible in the locations that these populations are in, so that if supply chains are compromised further as the pandemic grows, that we have the food in place. Number one priority. Number two is then scaling up operations. How do we respond to the new needs being presented to us by this crisis? These are the populations in these urban centers. Normally, we don't provide food assistance in places like Nairobi, in places like Kampala, in places like Addis Ababa. But we're already seeing as the informal sectors and the economies are undermined and weakened, and employment sector is undermined, the governments are now asking us to come in and assist some of these populations. So we've got the double challenge of sustaining operations, to those we assist already, and scaling up to the new needs.
So you talk about, Matthew, you talk about scaling up operations, but in times of emergencies, governments often look externally for funding or for further assistance. But in this scenario of COVID-19, every country in the globe is affected, and there might not be many avenues to seek for that external assistance. How do you think Africa is going to overcome this challenge?
Well, many of the governments in this region are already taking action themselves. They're drawing on their own resources. They're reprioritizing their own national budget so that they can have some level of resources to meet the immediate needs. The immediate challenge is the containment of the public health emergency. So it's all the public health needs and the containment needs of the pandemic. We're also looking with governments at this whole socio-economic impact and the impact on people's livelihoods and their food security. So governments are already, we're seeing governments making financial allocations, diverting budgets to support that type of emergency food response. But undoubtedly, they're going to need international assistance as well. So the government's already in touch with the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, for emergency budget support to supplement their own efforts. And I think also through the UN and through the multilateral system as well, we're going to have to mobilize significant resources. So we're going to have to make the case to all of our donors internationally, in conjunction with the governments that we're working with here in Africa, that a failure to act could really have very catastrophic consequences for this continent.
And this has been an unprecedented time for everybody, particularly for the African continent. And as you've mentioned, the African governments are now looking internally, redefining their public health requirements. When you look at how organizations and governments have reacted to this particular emergency, what might your organization wish could be done better to respond to such emergencies in the future? What tools do you think we need to have to prepare further?
I think obviously we need to be in fact no country was really prepared for the scale of this outbreak. It's taken country by country by shock in many ways, just the scale of it and how it affects every walk of life. So I think the implications of this crisis is not just public health. It's not just a health sector issue. It's the whole of society issue, the whole of the economy issue, and how we interact with each other, not just internally within our own countries, but internationally. So there's the implications are enormous. But in terms of how can we prepare better, we've got to get the emergency arms of government and the international system really sharpened to be better prepared. That means pre-financing of the public health aspects of the emergency food needs, and it means a lot of what we call system strengthening in some of the mechanisms like social protection that governments have. So more and more people are going to be vulnerable. So we're going to need to be providing longer term support to populations as a result of this pandemic and to help them prepare for the next one.
So when you talk about, though, because you've been mentioning about the 6 million people internally displaced that WFP was already trying to assist in terms of the medium term, in terms of the short term and the long term, if there is a prolonged, time lag for containing COVID-19, what do you see happening to Africa's food security situation?
Well, it's gonna need a massive investment across all sectors. I mean, it's very much linked with poverty. We can't separate the issue of poverty and underemployment and unemployment from hunger, as well as conflict. They all intertwine. So it's going to need an absolute cross-sectoral, international, multifunctional effort to address the food needs, because you can't address food needs by just providing food. We're going to have to be looking at employment strategies, particularly in these urban centres. We're going to need to be looking at longer term solutions to internal displacement, as well as at conflict resolution. These populations are living in these highly densely populated refugee camps and IDP camps because of conflict. And they're more vulnerable to a pandemic like COVID because they're in these highly densely populated settlements. That's why urban centres as well in these countries are vulnerable, because of the density of population. So we're going to have to be looking at all of these issues. How do we reduce the densities? How do we change employment patterns? And how do we improve longer term safety nets? All of that will be necessary in order to improve the longer term prospects of people's food security.
So in terms of looking at the longer term, improving food security in the long term, I want to get a solution from you as we wind out this interview. I want to get a recommendation and a solution from you in terms of what your organization's recommendations would be in mitigating the risks of the pandemic on food security and nutrition. What will be done?
Number one is to keep borders open. I think a protectionist response to this crisis will have disastrous effects. We're already seeing actually governments within this region are cooperating with each other and are keeping the commodities flowing, the food commodities throughout the region. So we're seeing governments imposing restrictions on movement, particularly of people, but they're making exceptions for food and agricultural produce to keep flowing. So our number one ask is to maintain the cross-border flow of these commodities so that those people who are dependent on markets to buy their food, they're not producing their own food, those people can then access food at the right cost at the right time. If that doesn't happen, and if we have a protectionist response to this crisis, it will only make it worse.
All right. Matthew McKilvin, thank you very much for your insights, and thank you for joining us on the program. Well, for now, we'll take a short break. When we return, we'll have more on the impact of COVID-19 on food security in Africa. Do stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now look at the economic impact of COVID-19 on African economies. And I'm joined from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, by Dr. Vera Songwe. She's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. Songwe, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, let's start off by looking at Africa in 2019, because barely 3 months ago, Africa's economic growth for 2020 was on an upward trend. The AFDB had projected Africa's economic growth at 3.8% in 2020, 4.1% in 2021. However, original economic forecasts in most economies around the world are being downgraded. In Africa, what are we looking at?
Africa, like the rest of the world, is, as you know, in a global recession, according to the IMF. And so we're also looking at a downward trend. The Economic Commission for Africa has predicted that depending on the intensity and the scale of the crisis, which would really depend on policy reforms, we can drop from 3.4% growth in 2020 to about 1.8, or maybe even a little bit lower than that, closer to zero.
So we are probably going to drop up to 1.8%. Intra-Africa trade has been affected. Global trade is now affected. I know you held a virtual meeting of African finance ministers. In terms of African governments, what are their concerns? What are their strategies for recovery?
I think they're concerned about three things. The first one, of course, is human lives. We need to save lives. We need to ensure that people are fed. We need to ensure that people have the basic needs, health services, education. And then, of course, the economy. We're losing a lot of our businesses. And so we do not have the sort of productive capacity that we need because of interrupted supply chains across the world. And then the private sector. A lot of our economies are made up of small and medium enterprises and a certain amount of the informal sector. We need to ensure that those people can continue to earn a living, continue to be prosperous. And so they worry about how and what policies they need to put in place to ensure that those will take place. And then finally, on the trade front, we need to ensure that trade continues, because trade is what is going to take us out of this crisis. But if we cannot trade because borders are closed, it becomes quite difficult.
Right, but the World Bank also is giving a grim projection and saying that perhaps Africa now is going to be in recession for the first time in 2020, is saying that as a result of COVID-19, and it is actually asking for a debt standstill for up to $35 billion for countries in the region. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll be very happy if the World Bank is asking for it. We have been asking for it as the Economic Commission for Africa, as well as the finance ministers, asking for a debt standstill for 2 years, we're asking, and for all of Africa. Again, the IMF said that there's a global recession. So every country in the world is in a recession. And so that means essentially that we're stopping growth, and there's no way to get out. The only way that we can do that is to create stimulus packages that can ensure that countries can at least begin to re-engage their productive capacities, put more people to work. I think we're estimating that about 30 million people may lose their jobs because of the COVID crisis. To bring those people back to their jobs, we'll need to give financing to the private sector. We'll need to ensure that the public sector can reopen the schools, that we can pay the nurses that are going to be helping us take care of this pandemic, and the doctors.
Various governments have reacted in different ways. And in terms of crisis, though, usually there is some sort of external funding that countries can look up to. But this time around, the whole world is facing a crisis. What are the practical options for Africa at this point?
Well, again, we're asking for a debt standstill. A debt standstill is simple. It means that countries had all intended to pay interest and principal on their debts that they owed to other countries. So this is resources that they have already budgeted. And so they have it in their budget, and we're about to pay it out. And when you say debt standstill, it means no longer don't pay out those debts. Use it for engaging your populations, for providing the social safety net, for providing the food that is going to be needed. So that's what a debt standstill means, that you get immediate access to new credit, to new resources that you can use. In addition to that, we're also asking for $100 billion to ensure that we can actually come to terms with this crisis. You appropriately said the rest of the world is giving themselves stimuluses, and so I think we're looking at this as another way of helping Africa come out. But before we talk about what the rest of the world should do for us, African countries are doing a lot for themselves. As you know, many countries have asked companies not to pay taxes. Many companies in Egypt, for example, they've reduced the cost of electricity. In places like Senegal, they've asked for mobile money payments for the fee and the cost of that to be reduced or cancelled. The same thing in Kenya. So there's a lot that's already happening. When you have a recession and when you have this kind of a standstill, you're no longer collecting revenues. And if you're not collecting revenues, it's very difficult then to be able to respond to all the demands of your society. That is why we're asking for a debt standstill.
And this has put African countries in a very precarious situation. And as you've already mentioned, African countries are already doing a lot for themselves. But if, in terms of looking inward and in terms of self-sufficiency from African governments, which areas do you think policymakers need to address urgently to overcome the crisis and looking forward, though, post-COVID-19?
I think there's a few areas. I mean, the first one, of course, is governance. We need to make sure that we manage better, that we manage more appropriately, that we improve our targeting, that now we have we don't have the access to as much resources as we need. So every dollar will count. And so ensuring that the governance, the efficiency and the effectiveness of the use of these resources is transparent, and that civil society and institutions like yours, the media, can control and monitor, that is going to be particularly important. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that, during this crisis, we do not lose our agriculture sector, and maybe on the contrary, help grow the agriculture sector so that Africa can trade more and more with itself in terms of food. I think that one of the things that's coming out of this crisis, as you have certainly seen, is the fact that we are lacking personal protective equipment. Some of this we can produce on the continent, so hopefully that some companies will get spurred to do that, and so there will be some more industrialization happening on the continent. And finally, in the service sector, that we should do more and be prepared for when there is a downturn, that we have resilient methods in the system to help us address those issues. And that is coming back to the safety net systems.
Right. Agriculture, which is the mainstay of many African economies. The World Bank also is projecting that the region could face a severe food security crisis, and agricultural production is expected to contract by between 2.6% and 7%. Looking at the way most of African economies are, dominated by the informal sector, what is the worst case scenario that we could be facing here on?
Well, the Economic Commission for Africa has done a lot of work. As you know, when we did the work with the ministers of finance, we looked out at what is it that we need to do and how can we do it better. Of course, we did a lot of work around the food crisis. Africa only imports 10% of its food, but that 10% is an important proportion of what we import. It's rice, it's wheat, it's sugar, it's edible oil. So those are basic food commodities that we consume. We do a lot of agriculture as well that we export, but we do not consume what we export, and therein lies the asymmetry. So we have to make sure that on the continent, we can also begin to produce more of what we consume and ensure that going forward, Africa can trade more with itself. And I think this is the logic of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, is how can we ensure we're, at the end of the day, 1.2 billion people, we can create a market that can help us together recover. But for us to do that, we must be able to open our borders when this crisis is over and ensure that we take opportunities that exist on the continent and benefit from them.
So this has been an unprecedented time for African economies, of course, and there are lessons that are going to be learned from this pandemic, how governments are handling it, and how governments can also, try and be self-sufficient moving forward. In terms of recommendations to mitigate against the economic risks of the pandemic for African countries, what is your organization recommending?
We're recommending three things. Of course, the first one is to increase awareness about the pandemic, to understand, so that people can understand what you need to do to flatten the curve. By flattening the curve, we mean reduce transmission. If people stay home, if people reduce contact with each other, or if they have contact with each other, that they are appropriately protected, as you are, then that will immediately begin to reduce contamination. But once we have contamination, then we have to ensure that we can actually come to the service of these people by creating the right healthcare services, getting the right ventilators. We need to test. So it's first preparedness, prevention, and then testing. We must test as much as we can. Then, of course, there is a lot of work that's happening at the African Union and CDC Africa with WHO to ensure that all the other intensive care and curative materials that are needed, the ventilators and the ICU units and the oxygen, are available for the continent. So that's the first thing I think we worry about, is human lives, and what is it that we can do to protect them. It starts with prevention. It starts with ensuring that we keep our physical distance. Socially, we can stay connected as we are doing now, but physically, we should try to stay as far away from each other as possible. On the second front, of course, is the economic front. We talked about the debt standstill, which should essentially also then allow us to unleash this $100 billion, which will be able to get into the pockets of governments and ensure that governments can come to the assistance of their citizens. The private sector, the tourism industry, the recreation industry is in trouble. We will need to ensure that we can bring those back. We're also already working with the private sector to see what areas of the private sector can continue to function so that we keep the jobs open and ensure that, even as the Secretary General will say, we need to build back better. But to build back better, we have to start preparing now to ensure that, we still have lights. Energy projects must go on, because at the end of this, we're going to need a lot more electricity to reboot our economies and ensure that we can regain the growth prospects that we had and achieve Agenda 2030 if it's still possible.
All right, Dr. Vera Songwe, thank you very much for your insights on the impact of COVID-19 on African economies. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for your insights. Dr. Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Matthew McIlvena, Head of Emergency Preparedness and Response, East African Regional World Food Programme Bureau. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and on Twitter. And you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep the conversation going, and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, stay safe and goodbye.